Hello and welcome to Undivided. I'm Brandy Cruz. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your continuing commitment to give common sense a comeback. If you have not become an Undivided subscriber already, remember we do a bonus episode like this every single week. Why would you not? It's $5 a month. You can subscribe in two ways, patreon.com/undivided, or you can become a contributor on my locals community, brandycruz.locals.com. A bunch of stuff to get to today. Nancy Pelosi ends her run as Speaker of the House. Some Republicans are being accused of snubbing her during her goodbye speech, not her goodbye speech from Congress, but her goodbye speech as far as being in a leadership position. Also, Merrick Garland came out today and appointed a special counsel for their remaining probes into former President Donald Trump, which I think is a good thing. I don't know if it'll make a difference, but we'll discuss that. Also, a really great interview for you. A former City of Seattle employee is suing the city, saying he was discriminated against on the basis of race. The interesting part is he's white. And his attorney is going to join us to go over in detail the allegations in this case and more broadly what she thinks the city of Seattle needs to do to sort of make sure that these equity initiatives don't cross the line. Also, of course, we'll have a Florida report with my sister Miranda talking about some stories that have come out about Governor Ron DeSantis. He's going to be increasingly in the spotlight now that he's running for president, and rightfully so. Anyone who runs for president should be under scrutiny and in the spotlight for everything they do. I want to start with Nancy Pelosi, though. So she has ended her time in House leadership. She made that announcement. And by any standard, she's had a historic career, the first female Speaker of the House. I want to play you just a little piece of the speech that she gave in announcing her departure from leadership.
Now we must move boldly into the future, grounded by the principles that have propelled us this far and open to fresh possibilities for the future. Scripture teaches us that for everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. My friends, no matter what title you all, my colleagues, have bestowed upon me, speaker, leader, whip, there is no greater official honor for me than to stand on this floor and to speak for the people of San Francisco. This I will continue to do as a member of the House, speaking for the people of San Francisco, serving the great state of California, and defending our Constitution. And with great confidence in our caucus, I will not seek re-election to Democratic leadership in the next Congress.
So a couple things about Nancy Pelosi's career. She was the first woman elected to be the Democratic whip in 2001. She was elected party leader in 2002, Speaker of the House in 2007, and had been the Speaker of the House every time Democrats were in control of the House. Since then, obviously, Republicans took narrow lead and controlled the House, which will make, it sounds like, Kevin McCarthy the House Speaker of the House. And the other thing that's been pointed out is, you know, when she joined Congress, there was very few women serving in Congress compared to today. And I think that is significant. We always want to make progress in that regard. One of the things, and look, you know, I wish we could do a better job at separating our feelings about politicians and their politics from that person's accomplishments. And I had retweeted something Nancy Pelosi sent out, just sort of bidding farewell. And I was really not surprised, but always disappointed by the level of vitriol being thrown at her. And it's like, can't you wish the woman well? Isn't this what you've wanted, is for her to kind of step down out of those high-profile roles anyway? And I was disappointed. You know, I saw Mika on MSNBC really go after Kevin McCarthy, and I got to say, I don't necessarily disagree with her. So Kevin McCarthy and several other Republicans did not attend this speech that Nancy Pelosi gave. And Kevin McCarthy's excuse was that he had meetings. And he says that normally other people making a speech like that would do it when we had votes, so everyone would be there. And if she had done that, I could have been there. I'm sorry, Kevin McCarthy. I'm sure you had meetings, but you could have taken some time out to be there, show an ounce of grace, and respect for this woman who has been in that position on and off for such a long time. And so it's really disappointing to me that that's sort of where we've arrived at. And it's like, you can have not liked Nancy Pelosi when it comes to her politics, but not only is she a historic figure, really a trailblazer for women in Congress, her husband just went through this incident. And so it's just like, can't you just show up for the woman? Stuff like that just disappoints me. So anyway, Nancy Pelosi, no longer Speaker of the House, will never be, according to her, Speaker of the House again, is paving the way for a new generation of Democratic leadership. And I think that's a good thing. I've always said that with Nancy Pelosi, I don't understand this need that some people have to kind of die in their seat and die in their positions. And I think there are some people in the Democratic Party, kind of the younger, more progressive wing, that would have tried to push her out of that spot anyway, the next time around. So best of luck to Speaker Kevin McCarthy, certainly. I'll see how he does and what they're able to push through. I will say I was already deeply disappointed with Republicans coming out and saying, as one of their first orders of business, that they're going to launch investigations into the Biden family and its ties to China. And look, it's not that I don't think those things are important. Like, we want to make sure all of our politicians are above board, that they don't have any conflicts of interest that would be a national security risk to the country. But that's the first thing that the first major announcement you want to make. Like, the country in economic peril, crime rates out of control, all these things that you ran on. I mean, by and large, Republicans didn't run on, we're going to investigate the Bidens and Hunter Biden. No, they tried to, many of them, run on the economy, crime, inflation, etc., gas prices. It's like, even though you only have the House, can we not you're not going to get anywhere with that stuff. You're not going to get anywhere with that stuff. There's a Democratic president in power. Democrats control the Senate. You're just wasting time. And I understand you're like, well, they investigated Trump. Okay. So we're just going to get, every time that power changes over, it's just going to be a new investigation into one of your political enemies. It's one of the things I hate the most about where we find ourselves in this political system. Attorney General Merrick Garland came out today and named a special counsel to kind of carry forward the Justice Department's remaining investigations into former President Donald Trump. So, of course, there are kind of two simultaneous things: the ongoing investigation into what documents he had at Mar-a-Lago, what the purpose of having them there was, et cetera, and then into aspects of what his role may or may not have been in the January 6th attack at the U.S. Capitol. And I think that the justification behind appointing a special counsel for Merrick Garland is pretty clear.
The Department of Justice has long recognized that in certain extraordinary cases, it is in the public interest to appoint a special prosecutor to independently manage an investigation and prosecution. Based on recent developments, including the former president's announcement that he is a candidate for president in the next election, and the sitting president's stated intention to be a candidate as well, I have concluded that it is in the public interest to appoint a special counsel. Such an appointment underscores the department's commitment to both independence and accountability in particularly sensitive matters.
So the special counsel's name is John Smith. Apparently he goes by Jack Smith, though. He was previously the chief of the Justice Department's Public Integrity Unit. He's currently a prosecutor at The Hague, a former federal prosecutor. And he's going to continue to look into it. It says, according to NBC News, that he's tasked with investigating whether anyone violated the law, including whether Trump violated the law in connection with, quote, the lawful transfer of power following the 2020 presidential election, or the certification of the Electoral College vote that was held on January 6th. And also, of course, just the ongoing probe into the classified and other documents that were found at Trump's house in Mar-a-Lago. So I think it makes sense to try to distance the Justice Department and Merrick Garland and thus Joe Biden from any sort of investigations that are ongoing into Donald Trump. I don't think, for people who already don't believe in the justice system's ability to be apolitical, I'm not sure that a special counsel is going to completely take care of all those concerns. But given the fact that you have two people who might be running against each other in 2024, I mean, this kind of seems like a no-brainer. I've said for a long time that I really feel like some of these race and social justice equity programs cross a line. I mean, the city of Seattle and other entities, having meetings strictly for people of one race and not the other. And, where does the line, where is the line from, hey, we're striving for fair treatment and equality for all? Where does that cross the line to, in order to get there, we're going to put down or push down people of another race, white people? So I was really interested and intrigued to hear that a former Seattle City employee, a white guy named Joshua Diemert, he has filed a lawsuit, a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city of Seattle, claiming racial discrimination, a hostile work environment, he claims because of the color of his skin. His attorneys are offering up several examples that they say prove that he was treated differently. He was discriminated against. He was subjected to a hostile work environment because he's white. I had a lengthy conversation with the attorney in this case to talk about the details of the case and what evidence they have to prove his claims. Laura, welcome to Undivided. Introduce yourself to folks.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on your show. My name is Laura D'Agostino, and I'm an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation.
What does the Pacific Legal Foundation, what kind of cases do you typically handle?
So we are a public interest law firm, and we focus on very specific areas of constitutional litigation. I'm part of the Equality and Opportunity Group, so generally we're looking at violations that are occurring across the country that would go against the 14th Amendment. And my colleagues, some of them are focused on property issues, so defending clients against home equity forfeiture, against eminent domain, and other specific property issues that come up. And then I also have colleagues that work on separation of powers, which is just a fancy term for ensuring that Congress doesn't improperly allocate its authority amongst agencies and that everything is going according to the Constitution to ensure a system of checks and balances.
You guys, the case we're about to discuss, you're doing it pro bono. Why?
So just by virtue of being a public interest firm, we want to be in a position to vindicate people's constitutional rights who might not otherwise have the resources to do so. And I think that's one of the most rewarding aspects of my work, is just being able to represent some of the most wonderful clients imaginable and help give them a voice when they might not otherwise have the resources to do so.
Based on what your law firm does that you just described to us, obviously discrimination cases are going to be a part of that. How often do you guys see cases where it's a white person who's claiming that they're being discriminated against on the basis of race?
So we're actually seeing this come up more often now because of what we view as an ideology that's kind of sweeping our nation, in the sense that we see a focus on everything being about race. And it comes under many different names. Some people refer to it as critical race theory. Some refer to it as equity. It goes by many different names. But what we're seeing is sort of a groupthink mentality, in the sense that people are no longer being evaluated as individuals, but instead they're being grouped into whatever their racial identity may be. And there are governments, there are groups that intend on classifying them and making judgments about them on the basis of race, which is the most unconstitutional and immoral approach you can take when you approach anyone. This is the very definition of bias.
Yeah, and it's very odd. You see our country and how far it's come when it comes to race and seeing past skin color. And it's like there's this weird kind of turn in the other direction. And I think some of this is well-intentioned, but I think some people are oblivious to what they're doing, and you obviously have initiatives that kind of go too far. So just at the very core, there's no question that discriminating against someone on the basis of race, regardless of what their race is, their skin color is against the law. So this case really comes down to the facts of the case and what you're able to prove. So take us through the facts of the case and take as much time as you want.
Absolutely. So Joshua Diemert, our client, is a former City of Seattle employee. He worked in their human services department, and this was truly a dream job for him because he has a real heart for service, and he was really excited to apply his technological know-how in a way to be able to make the city's resources more accessible to marginalized communities in Seattle. And so what started occurring from day one in the office, despite the fact that Joshua was sought out by members of other departments, he even received an award for his work, he started noticing that every aspect of everything he did came down to the city's racial analysis. Now, in order to form a good context about everything that Joshua went through, you have to understand that the city of Seattle has a program called the Race and Social Justice Initiative. It began in 2005, but it was really formulated in the late 90s. It was sort of in some brainstorming sessions. There were people thinking about this. And what the Race and Social Justice Initiative purports to be is an effort to end structural racism. So all the terms the city uses to describe the program actually sounds like a noble venture to reduce bias and to ensure equality in the workplace. Yeah. However, what it actually translates to, and when you actually see the training documents that the city uses as part of this program, it is not only inherently unconstitutional, but it is also just purely discriminatory in every way. And how it's applied is that employees have to fulfill at least 2 activities each year that either promote the program or it encompasses training that has to do with it. And the city also coerces its employees to participate in these groups called caucuses. And according to your racial identity, that's the caucus you can attend. So they have a white caucus, they have an African American caucus, they have an Asian American caucus, and they explicitly promote racial divisions among their employees. So I wanted to kind of spell out, this is the background of what's going on here. And they even have a racial equity toolkit, which every city policy must apply a racial lens whenever it does anything. And all departments ultimately stream data and information to the mayor, who oversees everything and ensures that the departments are doing their job to implement this initiative across the board. This is really at the foundation of everything our client went through, apart from the individual discrimination that he went through. So how it started with him, at one point, he was serving in a supervisory role, and he needed to take some time off in order to deal with a chronic health issue. His supervisor at the time told our client, Mr. Deitmer, that he should resign from his position because, according to her, he was being selfish and he was holding back people of color from being able to be a supervisor. And so you can imagine our client was shocked that he actually was approached by a supervisor this way. And when he went and reported it, he felt that he was not only not supported, but that HR and the other management levels were in support of what his supervisor was doing. And so
just to be clear on that, so he had a medical issue, and I'm assuming this is FMLA?
Correct, yes.
So legally allowed to take it. And the idea being that instead of going on some extended leave, he should resign so someone of color could promote?
Exactly. That was what his supervisor told him. And this would have been exactly in line with the Race and Social Justice Initiative, because this program focuses on promoting whatever racial groups it has determined should be promoted, because it divides everyone based on oppressed or oppressor. And it goes even deeper than that. There are even characteristics that they define of white supremacy. And if you see their internal documents, it's not what you think. Characteristics of white supremacy include things like being on time, having an obsession with perfectionism. If you are from a European background, or you are a Christian background, or you are non-disabled, these are all characteristics that put you in this privileged group. And so if you are in that group that the city defines, you are inherently racist, both consciously or unconsciously. And that's the badge you have forever while you're working in that office. There's nothing you can do. There's no goodwill you can show. You will always be classified as being someone that possesses this subconscious racism, because you live in a system that privileges you. And so this is what's going on. And so Mr. Deitmer was following the law, taking leave that he was entitled to, which, by the way, it's also against the law to discriminate against someone for taking this type of medical leave. Right. And he was being told, you're being selfish by trying to hold on to your job because there's a person of color who could be doing your job while you're taking your medical leave.
It's one thing for him to say, hey, this happened to me. Do you have proof that that happened to him?
When it comes to everything that our client went through, we have extensive documentary evidence that backs up not only the training materials, the discriminatory messaging of everything. With respect to the FMLA leave, we do not have a documented email that contains that description, but we have evidence of each time that Mr. Deitmer reported it and his summary and to all the supervisors it went to.
You have kind of a trail after the fact of him saying, hey, this just happened to me.
Exactly. Yes.
But the initial incident where it says, hey, you should just resign so someone of color can be promoted, that was verbalized to him.
It was verbalized to him.
You have some other kind of supporting stories that go along with this narrative and sort of contribute to it. Can you talk about some of the most hostile things that Mr. Deitmer encountered allegedly during his time with the city of Seattle?
Absolutely. So I'll give you a couple of the main examples, but there are many that occurred during his 8.5 years with the city. One time he found a fellow coworker denying applicants based on race. So in the Human Services Department, there would be people that would apply for access to city services. And his coworker said that she was deliberately denying white applicants because they had privilege. When Mr. Deitmer reported that to his supervisor at the time, he was told that it's impossible for whites to be discriminated against because they live in a system of white supremacy. So it's impossible for a white person to ever experience racism, and he shouldn't have reprimanded his coworker for doing that.
What kind of services were these that people were seeking from the city and being allegedly denied for on the basis of race?
So there were a couple. There's the vehicle rebate program. I don't recall the specific service that involved in this applicant. I can follow up with Joshua so that I can get that detail. But it would have been, there were programs where applicants could have gotten help with paying certain bills, whether it be their utilities. There was a utility discount program. I believe it would have been the utility discount program, but I would have to verify with Joshua.
So these are citizens of Seattle coming to the city with some sort of financial need, trying to apply for it. And it's Mr. Deitmer's allegation that his colleagues were refusing that, not on the basis of need, but on the basis of skin color.
Yes, that was one specific example that he found of a coworker denying people just because of the color of their skin.
He also had, I read, some really personal sort of attacks and interactions with fellow employees because he was white. Can you talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. So another major example that we found, within the city of Seattle, they have a system called SharePoint where employees can upload articles, they can correspond with one another. And one of Mr. Deitmer's coworkers uploaded an article that talked about the Tulsa massacre, I believe, of 1921. And Mr. Deitmer posted his comments about that and how he felt that the coworker was slanting this historical event. Well, after that, there were fellow coworkers that read what Mr. Deitmer had posted, and we have this email thread. And within the email thread, they compare Mr. Deitmer to being a Nazi. They said that they wish that someone would find him in the bathroom and beat him bloody, and that he was just someone that they don't even want to bother responding to because he'll just come back with, quote, more idiocy. So there was immense hostility from there. And Mr. Deitmer often wondered why he was getting all these weird looks around the office, why he was encountering this hostility. That's one example. But the most egregious example that we found is that Mr. Deitmer reported one of his coworkers for trying to fraudulently get benefits for a family member that owned a daycare. So there was some kind of benefit that these daycares could get by applying with the city to get some relief. And Mr. Deitmer found that his supervisor at the time was trying to get him to approve this very specific application. But when he went and looked into it, he realized that this was a family member of his supervisor. And so he reported it to ethics. And when his supervisor found out about it, he accosted him not once, but twice. And the second time, he got in his face, chest bumped him, and said that Mr. Deitmer had only reported him because he's a white supremacist, he's a racist, and that it's not his fault if he had tried to commit fraud because he lives in a system of white supremacy. Mr. Deitmer, again, reported all of these incidents, and the only solution the city had was to just move him one cubicle over, and he was forced to continue reporting to that same supervisor for the remainder of his employment with the city.
Wow, a couple things there. You mentioned this email thread, basically comparing him to Nazis, saying he should be beaten bloody. You're saying that you have those emails.
We do.
And do those employees who engaged in that kind of language still have jobs with the city of Seattle?
My understanding is that they're still both employed with the city of Seattle, but I would need to verify to see if they're still with the city.
And have you released their names publicly?
No, we have not yet released their names publicly.
Well, I wouldn't release them publicly per se, but I would like to get those names from you so I could check on their employment status with the city.
I will send that to you offline, since there's some things we're doing as well.
Yeah, and I certainly don't want them to be targeted while all this is being sorted out, but I think that's a worthy question, is what the city did about that. In regards to the incident with the chest bumping, et cetera, is his supervisor, what's the race of his supervisor?
His supervisor that engaged in this conduct was African American.
And is there witnesses to that?
Yes. Our understanding is that there were one or two witnesses that saw what happened.
So obviously this isn't a criminal case, so the standards by which it proceeds are a little bit different. It's not reasonable or guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, et cetera. In this case, first, where does the case stand? Where do things stand?
So we went ahead and filed our complaint with the federal court. Now we're in the process of serving the complaint on the government. And then at that point, the government will have an opportunity to respond, and we'll see what the natural course is at that time. We'll see what information we want to do. It depends what motions they file. So we're still in the very beginning aspects of it because we just filed a few days ago.
And has he previously tried to file a claim with the city of Seattle, or is this the first legal action of any kind he's taken?
So apart from Mr. Deitmer repeatedly reporting all of these incidents of discrimination and hostility that he encountered, he also filed a charge with the EEOC. And then when we got involved, we helped him file a second charge with the EEOC. So before you can bring a Title VII action, you have to first go through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And so he went ahead and filed those charges with the commission and went through that process as well.
Okay, and are those pending, or was there a resolution to those?
So for the first charge, we received a decision back, and the finding was that there was no discrimination. So we requested our right to sue letter, it's called. So that way we can file in court. And for the second charge, they were not able to finish the investigation within the allotted time frame. So we asked for a right to sue letter for the second charge as well. And so that's why we're filing in federal court.
I guess based on what you've told me, I failed to see how it couldn't be an EEOC violation. Can you explain why they said it wasn't, what their rationale was?
It's very difficult to know exactly. There are so many factors that an EEOC agent can look into, and a lot of their notes of their investigation are redacted. So it's difficult for us to know what arguments they may have found persuasive. But what we can say is that we sent them hundreds of documents, and they rendered a decision about 2 or 3 weeks later. So it's our perspective that perhaps there are things that were overlooked, or it would be more conjecture for me to try to say what influenced the agent, because I cannot say with certainty. But we believe that there's overwhelming evidence of discrimination, of a Title VII violation, and no one should have to endure what Mr. Deitmer endured. And so that's why we're proceeding forth with litigation.
And was he fired? Did he resign? And if he chose to leave, what was the final kind of straw for him?
Sure. So Mr. Deitmer, after the increased hostility and everything he went through, he resigned because he had arrived to a point that it was either his health or his job. And he could not tolerate this environment anymore. And there were a couple of things that were really the final straw. After he filed his EEOC charges, He stopped receiving support from his supervisor. She canceled all of their monthly meetings. And she also refused to help him with some technological issues when he was working remotely from home because he was a high-risk person for COVID. So, and then on top of that, just the increase in the trainings, continuing to see emails that were just discriminatory. And as Mr. Deitmer puts it, no reasonable person would have been able to tolerate what was going on. And so he made the decision to resign and leave.
A couple more questions about what happens from here. If this ends up in a courtroom, what's the burden of proof here? Is it his word versus the city? I know you have some documentation, not for everything, but for some of the things that happened. So what is the burden of proof that you would have to reach to be, for your case to be convincing enough?
Well, when you're alleging a racially hostile work environment, there are several different factors that you have to prove to the court. So first, you have to show that Mr. Deitmer found the environment to be hostile, that the conduct was unwelcome. We have ample evidence of that. We have to show that a reasonable person would objectively find that work environment to be hostile. And based on everything we've heard and everything we've seen, as well as the comments that some of Mr. Deitmer's coworkers informed him of, we believe that that standard is met as well. You also have to show that the city was aware that this harassment was going on and didn't do anything to alleviate it. Again, given Mr. Deitmer's numerous reports, the city was on notice of everything going on, and there is no way for them to claim that they had no idea. We have internal emails that show that they were talking about Mr. Deitmer. We have extensive evidence about all of these. So we think that for all of the factors, we have the evidence to show that Mr. Deitmer experienced a racially hostile work environment. And to give you just a little bit more detail, the court doesn't look at one or two factors individually. They kind of view it as a broad, holistic analysis, if you will. It's not enough to allege a racially hostile work environment if someone said a mean comment to you once. It's not enough if you had maybe one questionable incident happen to you. But in our case, we have 8 years of not only Mr. Deitmer experiencing direct discrimination, but the unique aspect is that the very training that the city purports to be anti-biased and to be something non-discriminatory, the city itself was encouraging its employees to discriminate against others. And so that's what's the unique caveat about this. And it's our perspective that we meet all of those factors. And we also have evidence to show that the city treated Mr. Deitmer differently because of his race. And so we have a constitutional claim as well.
So what are you seeking? Money for Mr. Deitmer, or are you also seeking some sort of structural change to these programs within the city?
So we have twofold. We're asking for the monetary damages that are allowed under the law, but we're also asking for a declaration that the city's policies and procedures violated Mr. Deitmer's Title VII and constitutional rights. Everyone is free. Everyone has a right to be free from racial harassment in their workplace. And everything that we've uncovered shows that the city did the exact opposite of that.
Just two more things. There are people who do not believe in the concept of reverse racism. Is that, I don't know if it would go to a jury or something, but is that more difficult to kind of get someone to buy into this idea of reverse racism? Have you found it more difficult?
Well, Brandy, here's what I would say. I would even take issue with it being called reverse discrimination. I would just call it discrimination, period. I think anytime someone does not judge you as an individual, but judges you by the color of your skin, that in and of itself is discriminatory and unlawful. And it shouldn't happen to anyone. And I think that anyone that would have found themselves in Mr. Deitmer's position, no matter what their nationality, no matter what their background is, they would have found that conduct to be demeaning and offensive. And there were Mr. Deitmer actually had coworkers, both from different groups, that reported to him that they felt that this was demeaning to them. And they felt that they were being put in a box just because of the color of their skin. But they went along with it because they said, look, I've got a family to support. I don't want to stick my neck out there. I don't want to make enemies. And they saw how Mr. Deitmer had been treated. And that just the city's conduct towards him created an additional chilling effect. So that's what I would say, Brandy. I would say discrimination is discrimination. I don't think that we should call it reverse discrimination just because one group is at the tail end of it versus another. I think that anytime someone is treated as a member of a group, that demeans them and their unique individuality.
I think that's a really good point. Let's end with this. There's no question that this country has a terrible history when it comes to racism. And as we were saying earlier, I think some of this started as being well-intentioned. You want to make sure, as the government, that people aren't being discriminated against on the basis of race. And given for a long time in our history, those were Black people, brown people, and Asian Americans. So where, from a legal perspective, do you believe kind of the line is between a government entity trying to make sure that people who've been historically discriminated against don't continue to be, and then going too far in sort of trying to achieve that end? Where do you think is a line there?
I think the line comes down to this. I think if you want to address the concept of bias, that's something very noble and admirable, because you want to create work environments that allow people to focus on their work, to treat one another with respect, and to ensure that no one goes into a work environment where they feel unsafe. But I think that when you start grouping people and deliberately separating them on the basis of race, so saying, okay, if you are a white European, you need to go over there. If you are Hispanic, you need to go over there. When you start dividing people in this way, and then you also give out materials that says, hey, by the way, we put together a document that shows common behavioral patterns for people who identify with your racial identity, I think that that's horrendously egregious and it should not happen in any environment. So I would say where we draw the line is where you stop treating someone as an individual and you start making preconceptions and prejudices about them just because of the pigmentation of their skin. That it is so immoral to dismiss someone, to dismiss the unique soul that a person has just because of the color of their skin. And so I mean, I would go back to Martin Luther King's quote about judging people by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. So I think that if you want to talk about bias, that can be done so. And if you want to talk about history, that's perfectly fine. But when you want to talk about how you think people of different racial groups act, I think you're going past the line and you're disrespecting and demeaning people.
I have to agree. Laura, this has been so fascinating. I appreciate the level of detail that you brought to the conversation. We look forward to seeing where this case ends up.
Thank you, Brandy. And I appreciate having this conversation with you. It's really a pleasure to be on your show.
It's Friday. That means it's time to check in on what's happening in the Sunshine State. And I'm so glad we have this segment because there's a lot happening right now in Florida.
It's not even controversial anymore.
People know in Florida their freedoms are going to be respected.
Joining us is our Florida-based correspondent, my sister Miranda. Good day to you, ma'am.
Good day to you.
A couple things. Trump, had his announcement this week at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. And it's been interesting to watch how the media did or did not cover it. A lot of networks didn't take it live, and they took everything he did live in 2016. And so obviously there's some strategy there. But how the New York Post covered it in particular was actually kind of hilarious. But it's interesting because the New York Post is owned by Rupert Murdoch. So it seems like Murdoch is turning on Trump a little bit. So tell me what happened.
So if you were lucky enough to get your hands on a Wednesday copy of the New York Post, you'll see a tiny little banner at the bottom that says, Florida man makes an announcement, page 26. And if you flip over to page 26, there's a little article on the side, a little column that says, been there, done that. And Trump is the Florida man that they're referring to in this article. And the article starts out by saying, with just 720 days to go before the next election, a Florida retiree made the surprise announcement Tuesday night that he was running for president. And it just kind of goes on. It's a very funny article. You should put up a clip of it, but it goes on to just kind of speak on his announcement as if he is just some regular dude that lives in Florida and plays golf and lives a lavish lifestyle. At the very end, it says that Trump also served as the 45th president.
That's intentional trolling, but it is the ultimate Florida man story. But the implications, I mean, the New York Post, really all the media holdings of Rupert Murdoch have been very, very friendly to Trump over the years, and Fox News, et cetera. And it just seems like they're kind of riding this wave of let's move away from Trump and move toward Ron DeSantis.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that it'll be interesting to see what other media outlets kind of take the same approach to talking about Donald Trump, because we really got Trump to death during his presidency with the media. So maybe if they just reel back a little bit, like the New York Post, it won't be such a hard election season.
Well, maybe not that much. I mean, the New York Post was an obvious attempt at trolling, and it is kind of funny. But, I think, and I've been very critical of the press for their coverage of Trump. That was like 24 hours a day in 2016, because I really thought, when you get a lot of free airtime as a candidate, obviously it's going to help your campaign. But there is a happy medium. You can't just, as the press, decide, we're not going to cover the campaign of someone who was once the president. It doesn't mean you have to carry everything wall to wall. And so it'll be interesting to see where the media kind of lands, the mainstream media in particular, on its coverage of him. But speaking of DeSantis, I've been clear. I like Ron DeSantis. You like Ron DeSantis. He's doing very well. But now that he's really seriously, in a contention potentially to become the president of the United States, he gets the same treatment as every other politician from our show. And there's a couple things that have come up this past week about Ron DeSantis that he needs to answer for.
Absolutely. The first one we'll talk about is the anti-woke law that the Florida legislature put into, motion or approved earlier this year.
And that is what? Remind people what that is.
So that basically is a law that kind of uses like discrimination laws to his advantage by basically making it so teachers can't impose any sense of guilt on students when talking about racial and social issues, which I just feel like shouldn't be a way you educate kids anyway, by guilting them. So I don't think it's a bad law, but I also don't think that it's something that even needs to be a law. I think that that's something that universities and schools should address on an individual basis if they have a teacher that's pressing a little bit too personally on students. This judge basically referred to it as positively dystopian. And I think that's because once you get into college and university, I mean, these are young adults making decisions on what they want to learn about, decisions on how they want to speak. So I think that there's room for that kind of dialogue, as long as it's not pushing on somebody and there's no room for dialogue back to the teachers.
Yeah. And so what the judge has basically said is it just stopping it from being implemented?
Yeah, he's just stopping it from being implemented. Basically, it would cause any teachers to have to kind of re-oath themselves to not do this kind of teaching. So I think that he has something there, but I think he's reaching a little bit, because I don't think that it's something that's probably not as common as he wants people to believe by creating this bill.
Well, and I do definitely think that's happening in schools. We've seen it up in Seattle a lot. It's like, are you going to really shame some freaking 12-year-olds for slavery? Their ancestors had slaves, and they're like just 12-year-old kids. Like, why are you trying to make me feel bad about this? I do think that happens in schools, but I tend to agree with you. One, it's how do you define, how do you decide this teacher's guilting students versus this teacher's not? I mean, you might have some kids who just feel guilt on their own for what their race did, 100 years ago. I don't know how a kid's going to react. So I think it's a really hard law to implement evenly, if that makes sense. And then also there was something that came up about Ron DeSantis this week. So we talked about it on Florida Report a few months ago about Ron DeSantis getting a private jet to take migrants up to Martha's Vineyard. But there's some questions about where the money went, essentially.
So Tampa Bay Times has an article out this week. It headlines over $1.4 million so far unaccounted for in Florida's migrant flight program. It goes on to talk about how Governor DeSantis' administration had paid more than $1.5 million in taxpayer money to a politically connected contractor to fly migrants from Texas to northeastern states. The private jets, when somebody reached out to get a quote to see how much those flights should have cost, for two of them should have cost roughly about $150,000. So now there is $1.4 million, give or take, of that taxpayer funds that has not been accounted for in this process. And there really isn't much coming out of DeSantis camp about it. So it'll be interesting to see where that extra money actually went, because that's a lot.
Well, and I wouldn't put it past, I'm just pontificating, but I wouldn't put it past a contractor when they're dealing with the government to charge them just exorbitant rates because the government will just pay it, and so I think the government overpays for a lot of things because it's just not a good steward of taxpayer funds. And so if you've got this contractor that says, yeah, it's going to cost $1 million, like, okay, the government's like, fine. So yeah, interesting. I mean, definitely the DeSantis administration in Florida needs to sort of explain, hey, here's what we paid the contractor, here's what all that money went for. And that's just, everyone should want a good accounting of taxpayer money.
This is just where transparency is important in government. There should be no reason not to tell us where that money was spent, even if these contractors, gouged the price. Like, that, they should just say that these contractors gouged the price, and that is what it is. But it does suck to have to sit and wait for answers when you shouldn't have to wait. It should be as simple as providing receipts like anybody else would have to.
Yeah, for sure. And he is a governor who has been fiscally responsible. And so if that's the case and contractors sort of pulled one over on the state, then he should come out and be like, hey, we should have got some bids on this. We should have, looked around and et cetera. So I think that'd be a good thing for him. So, all right, Miranda. Well, it's cold as hell here, and I'm sure you're just warm.
Actually, we are going through a cold front right now.
Okay, define cold front.
It gets to be in the lower 60s at night.
Oh, you poor.
I have a sweater on.
You poor unfortunate soul. I'm sure I join all of our listeners in just extending our deepest sympathy to you.
I know, thoughts and prayers, but we have to participate in winter sometimes.
Oh man. Okay. That has been this week's edition of Florida Report. Miranda, thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
It's not even controversial anymore.
People know in Florida their freedoms are going to be respected.
Okay, we're going to get back to our regular Friday segments next week, Friday with Friends, Understanding America, but I wanted to end the show today by talking. You guys have to read this thread on Twitter. I still get asked, why would you leave your job in TV news? It seems like it's so much more kind of glamorous, et cetera, et cetera. This thread is just Exhibit A. Why I don't want to go back to mainstream news. So Steve Krakauer, who produces, he used to be with Mediaite, NBC, CNN, and now he is the executive producer of The Megyn Kelly Show. He had this tweet thread that was just epic. So he was talking about how yesterday's conspiracy theories are today's legacy media news reports. And we saw this during the pandemic, right? Where it was like, it was a conspiracy to even consider the fact that COVID originated in a lab. And it was like, if you even broach that subject, you were a right-wing conspiracist. And then it was like, oh, wait, that's kind of going to be something that the mainstream media now accepts as reality. And now it's not taboo to talk about. The same thing with the efficacy of masks. The same thing with possible side effects to the COVID vaccine that would justify the arguments against COVID mandates. And so it's sort of like, and there are some conspiracies that always remain conspiracies because they're crazy, but it seemed like there was this pattern during the pandemic of, oh, this is a conspiracy, ignore it, shame, whoever talks about it. And then a few months down the line, the mainstream media picks it up and now it's like, oh, okay, this is an accepted reality and now it's fine to talk about it and no shame. So Steve Krakauer is pointing out that a lot of this has happened in just the 9 days since the midterm elections. He says, here's a thread on some interesting stories that have emerged in just the past 9 days since the midterm elections. Surely no relation, of course, on the timing. And all these stories he's going to point out are currently being run in mainstream media. So one of them, he says, an NBC Bay Area reporter reported on the Pelosi attack based on a source who saw body cam footage. It was almost identical to what Miguel Almaguer said that got him suspended. So if you're not familiar, Miguel Almaguer, who is a national reporter with NBC, he had this report that, according to a source, Paul Pelosi, when the police arrived, ran kind of away from the police and back toward the suspect, and that's when he got hit with a hammer. Now, Miguel Almaguer's report went up briefly and then was taken down. And a week and a half later, NBC News suspended him, claiming that he used an unreliable source. But what Steve Krakauer is pointing out, that now there's an NBC Bay Area reporter who's using a source that has seen the body cam footage and is basically saying what Miguel Almaguer said. But obviously this one hasn't been taken down and scrubbed. And this article from the NBC Bay Area almost gives some credence to some of the people who really are questioning Paul Pelosi's behavior on that day. And remember, if you did that a few weeks ago, you were a terrible, awful, horrible human being. And now apparently it's okay for mainstream journalists to do it. There's another one. This one was in the Washington Post. The Washington Post reports, after all that secret docs drama, Trump raid produced basically nothing of interest. Quote, it does not point to any nefarious effort by Trump to leverage, sell, or use the government's secrets, just more about his ego and keeping mementos. So that's what the Washington Post says, that investigators, as they look through this, and federal agents who have reviewed these documents, don't see any evidence that this was something that Trump was keeping as leverage against the country or to make money off of, but it was almost like keepsakes. And now I'm not saying that makes it right. It's important to correctly handle classified information because it can put our assets overseas at risk and for a variety of other reasons. But it sounds like, and this doesn't surprise me, that it's shaping up to be like Trump kept these things because he wanted mementos from his time as president of the United States. Steve Krakauer goes on. NBC News reports the January 6th committee will ignore law enforcement failures in final report, instead making it all about Trump. And NBC News points out that there was this January 6th committee staffers were told that the preliminary plan for the final report would focus on Trump, not on any sort of law enforcement failures that day. And so now you have NBC News kind of talking about how the January 6th Commission is really and was always intended to be a witch hunt against Trump, as opposed to looking at and providing a report that talks about all the broad issues at play that day, which is what you should be giving to the American people. I mean, I also do care about Trump's possible involvement, how he could have better quelled the violence. But if the January 6th committee is going to be, if we're going to believe that it's something that is really unbiased, just wants to lay all the facts out from the day in that final report. Well, behind the scenes, NBC News, again, mainstream media, says that there is an effort to explicitly focus on Trump as opposed to other failures of the day. Another one in this Steve Krakauer thread, which again is just brilliant. He says, New York Times reports the number 2 man in the Oath Keepers, the far-right group, was actually an FBI informant, talking to them for months ahead of the Capitol attack. And this is something that, again, was deemed as sort of a conspiracy, that the government had these people in the crowd as informants. And this was like the number 2 guy of the Oath Keepers, who for months, according to the New York Times, was an informant for the FBI. And that's a big deal. And it's not a conspiracy. And it's something that people deserve to know about. Fascinating stuff. And then in a similar vein, again, we're going to continue on with the Steve Krakauer thread. New York Times also reports the FBI, quote, had as many as 8 informants inside the Proud Boys in the months before and after the January 6th riot. Despite this, New York Times asserts no evidence has surfaced suggesting that the FBI played any role in the attack. But again, here's the New York Times, a mainstream publication, opening the door with court papers. They're backing this up with information in court papers to something that I think previously had been considered a conspiracy, that you had FBI informants or government informants within these groups pre-Capitol attack. Now, that doesn't mean that they planted the idea to go to the U.S. Capitol and to break in, et cetera, but you do have to wonder, okay, what did these FBI informants know? When did they know it? Could the FBI have taken steps to prevent what happened on January 6th? So Steve Krakauer points out in just this thread, just a few of the articles in the last 9 days that are almost mimicking things that had been deemed conspiracy theories. And it's like, it's really tough because as soon as, something comes out that goes against this prevailing narrative, it's immediately like called a conspiracy theory, which really, I think, dissuades people from talking about it, especially in mainstream journalism, because they don't want to be seen as giving any air to conspiracy theories. And then eventually, a lot of these things end up being stories that the mainstream media, says, yeah, in fact, this is something that's happening. I don't know what to do about that. I mean, as the media, you can only glob onto a story when you have actual evidence to prove that it's true. So I'm not saying that the media automatically, instantly has to give credence to any sort of conspiracy theory that might pop up or any sort of theory that's not been proven. And it's just odd to me that you have so many examples and people are vilified so quickly when they raise a possible theory, as opposed to the media immediately saying, okay, we don't have to give any, air to this, but let's look into it and let's get to the bottom of it. So Steve Krakauer, you got to go read this entire thread and read some of these articles, because I think for people who have grown distrustful of the mainstream media, this really underscores where some of that distrust comes from. All right, that's it for today's episode of Undivided. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your continuing commitment to give common sense a comeback. I hope you enjoyed the interview on the story out of Seattle. I just find it so fascinating, and I really do think as a country, where are we trying to go? We have come such a long way in this country from moving on from the horrible history of racism in this country. Why are we trying to divide people in 2022? Why can't we look at the progress we've made, continue to make progress, as opposed to trying to split each other in these groups on the basis of race? It is something I will never be able to understand. If you have not become an Undivided subscriber already, you can do so in two ways: patreon.com/undivided, or you can become a contributor on my locals community, brandycruz.locals.com. I will see all of you on Monday.